I also want to come back to the practical work. So I've done some research with traditional livelihoods in Indonesia and also with the traditional fisher folk trade union. But after that time, I came back to Australia actually to work at the Institute for Sustainable Futures at UTS. So there is around 20 researchers there in the international development kind of research theme, among other sustainability researchers. And the approach that we take at ISF is to work particularly on applied research. So we work with NGOs, with government and the private sector. And the aim is to work on real world problems. So recently in the last few years, one of the examples of sort of intersectional research that I can think of is through the Water for Women grants. So I was involved with two of them. One was on climate change response for inclusive wash. That was in Indonesia and Timor-Leste. And this was working closely with Plan Indonesia, which many of you will know, Plan International that works particularly for the rights of children and girls. So they were focusing on sanitation in eastern Indonesia. And what this practice research did was look at how could we integrate climate resilience into the water and sanitation programs, and how could we better understand the outcomes for women and people with disabilities within this sanitation program, and bring those three themes together, and then actually design participatory action research activities so that communities could understand the climate impacts on their communities themselves, and to decide on interventions for their own communities with the support of the local government. Another project that I did around the same time was situated in Bangladesh with World Vision Bangladesh. It was on gender transformative social accountability. So social accountability looks at the relationship between citizens and government, and how there can be more accountability for delivery of basic services. So a kind of horizontal approach rather than a top-down accountability where citizens are just voting to elect in representatives. But during the time that government is in place, how can citizens influence what they're doing, what the public officials are doing with the resources? So including a gender transformative approach was actually about how can this not only address the needs of the poor, but also looking at a whole range of intersectional factors. So some of these different factors include it being rural. So rural communities included being particularly women that were most affected by sanitation needs and needing to provide water for their families. I was around climate change impacts, particularly affecting the areas of Bangladesh that most get flooded and affected by typhoons. Included migrants, it included all range of like marginalized groups, including sexual and gender minorities. So what this research did was push the envelope within World Vision to not only think of one group of people which are categorized as poor, but also what is the individual marginalizations within that group, and what is their identities that's affecting how they can access services as well. So yeah, that's sort of an overview of a couple of projects and what I've been doing the last few years in my career. And I just wanted to mention some things that enabled me and some challenges. So I think, yeah, the challenges that I found, one of them is really that a lot of these big challenges are like wicked problems. They don't have easy solutions. They're multidimensional and they're going to take a long time. And so there's often like not very immediate results that seeing from research or policy change, and that can be sometimes demoralizing. So I think for me, it's been really important to try and look after mental health and finding balance in that, and also finding a supportive community of people who care about the same things and who also want to affirm the values of social justice in the work. Another challenge, I suppose, is that while there's big resources going to, say, infrastructure or big economic development projects, the types of projects that I've been talking about, they're for groups that have less voice, and so they tend to be less resourced. So how to gain visibility for those types of projects and those types of communities also can take a lot of effort and sort of require building allies within government and working in collectives, like not working as an individual, I think is really important. And I think like earlier in my career, I would say that I had an experience that's similar to maybe other young women, where I was bullied in the workplace. And so I had bullying from both women and from men that were in more senior, powerful positions to me. And when I tried to seek help from human resources or other management, it wasn't really available. So in one case, I left an organization because of that. And I think at the time I sort of internalized that and thought, oh, there was something wrong with me or the way that I was operating. And I didn't really want to make a fuss. But I think with hindsight now, I realize like that I could have probably spoken to more people about it, like reached out to different people within the organization that would have had different perspectives. Even if the outcome was the same, like to still raise that awareness. So yeah, I suppose I mentioned that because don't want people to be alone, and that if they're going through similar experiences, to get help from other women in the sector or from people that they trust. Yeah, so I think that, yeah, the sort of themes that threads that I can see as sort of coming through is like around the community building and having a supportive community of practice within development sector, and also building up kind of some depth of experience and breadth of experience as well at the same time.
Okay, so I think Tamara has left us now with the opportunity to ask some questions. Think of your questions. I'm going to start with one, so you've got a couple of minutes to get your heads together. I was interested, you mentioned this project you did that was taking a gender transformative approach, and you described that as horizontal, or back when I was working in that particular area, and I don't know if this term's still used, we would have talked about gender mainstreaming, gender across all programs, rather than this thing over here where you deal with women. At least now we've moved on, we know that it's not just women who have gender. I'm wondering your thoughts about intersectionality more generally, and the extent to which that is able to be made horizontal across the sector. when there's so much else already vying for space. Thoughts about how you think this can be addressed, or if it is being addressed already, and what the risks are for that when a lot of NGOs already, and perhaps going in this direction because of what funders do, are siloing a lot of things. You know, here is our theme over here, we deal with this thing, or our refugee program is over there. What are the opportunities, do you think, for making more of those intersectional themes horizontal across organisations? Thanks.
Thanks, great question. I think, yeah, the concept of intersectionality has been around 3-4 decades, so it's not something new, and it's interesting that it sort of comes in waves about if attention is being paid to that or not. I think that the risk of not applying an intersectional lens to work on gender is that we end up with a kind of binary of women and men, and just losing a lot of nuance in that process. And I think that our understanding has shifted, and that we can see gender not just as a binary, but also as a spectrum, and something that is shifting and integrating more understanding of sexual diversity as well within gender work. So I think intersectionality as an umbrella helps with that. But it's also, yeah, looking, as you mentioned earlier, around the intersecting privileges and oppression. So one aspect is looking at systems of oppression like capitalism and patriarchy and sexism and heteronormativity. But another aspect is looking at individual characteristics like status as a migrant, nationality, age, and so on. And so, yeah, to integrate that into programming, I think it requires a deeper analysis and looking at with a finer tooth comb at the different experiences of individuals within whatever population of focus, whether it's for a policy or a program. When I talked about gender transformative approach, it can be seen as sort of parallel to intersectionality. So it's sort of further along from where programs used to be, which was really gender blind or reinforcing gender stereotypes, to then more gender sensitive approaches. And gender transformative is actually about changing the structures of inequality. I think that within the NGO sector in Australia, I think it's quite well appreciated, like intersectionality. I think the Australian aid program is working on it, and there's a new gender policy that's being developed. So it will be interesting to see if that language is even in there, or how it's being applied. Has anyone seen a draft?
And if anyone's seen the new aid policy, come and talk to me afterwards. Yeah, I think the point you raise about the notion of identity being so important with intersectionality, and then some of those identities in themselves being problematic, or we used to think of them as binary, but we don't anymore. You know, there's so much to say around all of that, which I'm sure we could get into later, but for now, let's go and see if anyone else has got a question for us. Don't be shy now. Excellent. No, we need microphones so that online can hear your excellent question.
Thanks very much, Tamara. It's probably a follow-on from Michelle's question. And I apologise if it's a bit of a clumsy question, but with the, DFAT funded programs and large funded programs, you'll see in there questions around needing to speak about or speak to gender, disability protection. Is this another add-on that will be quite discombobulating for our partners on the ground? And how is it different to those other elements?
So your question is intersectionality an add-on to gender, disability and protection?
Yes, I mean, I appreciate that it's something different, but is it something that is going to be more confusing or discombobulating for our partners and on the ground? Is it something that they're going to have to get their head around to then be able to adapt and their programming to be able to address intersectionality as well? And it's meant from the viewpoint of, I'm challenging you with that question. I also have another question, but I'll give that one to you first.
Thanks. Susie, is it? Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that possibly they're interchangeable. So the concept of social inclusion and gender is very similar to intersectional feminism. I think they're similar terms that are being used for a similar approach. And I don't think it necessarily needs to be confusing. From my experience working with practitioners in the field, their experience working with people is that they are beings with multiple identities, and that they do have different positions within different systems of oppression and privilege. So although the language itself might be needing translation, I think the concept of it itself is quite simple and can inform programming. So one way could be to look at a program from like who is this benefiting, and break it down and see who within a community is benefiting from this program, or what challenges they have accessing it. And if we're just asking a question about gender, we can ask a different question. So ask about other people with disabilities also able to access it? Are the ethnic minority groups able to access it? I'm not saying it's just access, but just as an example. And then going through these different groups and speaking to people with multiple different experiences can help to ensure it's a quality program.
Hello, I also actually have two questions, but I'm going to be cheeky and get them both in now. One is that you mentioned the research that you've been doing with for Bill and Melinda Gates about decolonising their programs and their whole thinking. And I was just wondering if you could mention a few just top level ideas that you had with them, because thinking about an organisation as large and as, well, salaried as that place is, I'd love to know the goss. And my second thing, which is also slightly gossipy, is I'm curious what your PhD's on.
Thank you. Well, I wouldn't say I managed to change the thinking of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Worked with a small team within water and sanitation program. And hopefully they spoke to a few people as well, and that's as much as I hope. But it came from them because they have an equity, diversity, inclusion strategy that they did want to operationalize in a meaningful way. And so a small segment of that was around how do they work with their grantees. So a lot of them, the grantees are in Africa and in Asia as well. And one challenge is often that those that are doing the work, as in implementing, for example, a program on sanitation, then they're not the ones that are being involved in writing the report or publishing the results of the learning from that project, because it has to be done in a certain format. Bill and Melinda Gates have like very long templates, and everything is in particular like development jargon in English, and not everyone has that. So what we developed was guidance for them about how to shift some of those norms. So like some of them are very practical around providing mentoring and coaching for people in writing and authoring work. But it's also like really important to back that with money and to include in their grants funding for that, and to simplify proposals, evaluation reports, what are the requirements of donors, and really question, is this actually what is helping your program, or is this just helping your organization? And that's sort of relevant not just to the Gates Foundation, but to many development organizations. And my research for my PhD is with the Southeast Asian Studies Centre. So I'm looking at community-based protection of refugees in Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia. It's particularly exploring the experiences of queer refugees, so those that are LGBT, that are in community-based programs in Asia. So I'm in my second year now, and developing some partnerships in those 3 countries and doing case studies. So very much still in progress.
Hi, Tamara.
Hi.
I think you touched on this kind of at the beginning, saying that we need to work together to develop a bit of a framework about how, so my question is more about like at the beginning of a project or a research design, at that inception, what sort of questions or elements do we need to be thinking of to make sure that like intersectionality is like considered from the very beginning? Kind of touching on what we're talking about before about gender mainstreaming, but just like what I feel like it's often like a hindsight thing sometimes as well, as the project's already underway or already funded. But yeah, like how can we make it more part of that like inception process or design process?
Thanks. That's a great question. I think that one thing that is commonly done, or maybe not commonly enough, is like a gender and political economy analysis at the start of a big program that might affect community. So those that are situated in a political context, and looking at what are the elements of gender relations as part of the systems of power. Might also look at risk factors, look at what are the social norms or cultural norms in that context. So I would suggest that in that phase might be possible to look at some of these different aspects of intersectionality. So to consider disability within that analysis, to consider the experiences of different people that are affected, and to actually include that in the design phase, so when the proposal is being built, so that can then influence what the outcome of the research is. And I think as well, because I have a bit of a researcher hat on, I would think about using more participatory methodologies, because that tends to include a more diverse range of stakeholders. So if it's not just the elites that the program designers are talking to, but also those with diverse perspectives, and that they can contribute their knowledge in different ways to inform the program design. Any ideas from other people, I'd be really happy to hear.
Thank you. I was wondering if there is a basic tool that could be developed to get researchers who are designing their studies to help them consider all the elements of intersectionality, and to create maybe like a, I don't know, a circle where you can start with some pre-populated things and then have other elements that you as a researcher can add just to help prompt your thinking. So you can come up with a spider diagram that sort of maps out the different shades of, for example, gender as they apply in that situation, but also different shades of city to rural communities, etc. Just the thought, really. What do you think?
Yeah, sounds like could be useful. I think there has been something done which is like a 3-stage process before for development practitioners that are implementing intersectionality. But I don't think it's widely applied, so it'd be useful to revisit that.
That can be your next research project. That's your postdoc.
Thanks.
Other questions? Yeah.
Sorry, I've got a bit of a croaky voice. Just sort of to continue that conversation a little bit, I think I've seen conceptual things where you were talking about like a wheel or a circle of sorts where, I don't know if it was IWDA who came up with it, or you can Google sorts of things where they do have, as an example, like a wheel of privilege, I think they call it, that sort of thing, a wheel of power or privilege, and you've got things like class and, yeah, rural to sort of urban, regional, rural, and other sorts of race, sexuality, sexual orientation, and various sorts of genders and other sorts of things that sort of can help to conceptualize the various types of, so many different types of, I guess, identities that each person holds and how that might influence, or what sort of hierarchy. I mean, and that probably changes depending on the context sometimes too. I think it's IWDA who has a really good one. You can see different formats of it, I think, around the place. Sorry, not a question.
Yeah, I think it's the looking at the individuals that are within programs or policies, but it's also trying to look at the overlay of different structures as well. So we're talking about privilege here. So for example, there might be like say there's a certain number of water taps that are going to be installed in the village, and those that come to the community meeting are allocated a water tap for their families, but it's actually then creates conflict later because it's found out that only certain groups within that community are getting the water taps, and those that couldn't attend the community meeting, say people with accessibility issues, or those that are not from the same like clan don't have access to that. So it's not then just looking at, is it the man or the woman that's the household head that gets to make that decision, but it's also looking at how power works at that local level, at the clan, but also different levels of how that program has been allocated resources that then influences the outcomes in that place. So I think it's helpful to look at these kind of cases which are local level, but then that also extends to cities, to countries at various scales as well, and how that plays out.
Chris, how much longer have we got?
I just thought I'd add an example. Last night I was in Brisbane for the Brisbane event, and we were listening to Michelle Dunn, who works at UQ and has worked in, I don't know how to say it, GEDSI, everybody will know apart from me, for a long time. She was giving an example of a Pacific Fisheries program she was involved in. And the leadership were in the room, as you say. But what her role was to ask who isn't there, who is in the room but not enabled or empowered to speak, and so doesn't have a voice. And there, they had female fisheries officers, and the men were really unhappy, and they launched a claim in court to get rid of them. The women disrupted the boats, and they created a lot of problems. But what they did, or what she did in her program, probably with others, was to go out and listen to the women who weren't in the room, but also the local communities who actually wanted to be fishing in that area. They were, I think they were putting in a protected area so nobody could fish. And what that did was show that there wasn't just one group, the women who were disadvantaged, but there were also disabled people who couldn't go further out, and a couple of communities that nobody talked to, and they actually relied on that area for fish. And so asking, you know, what are the interests of the people who are not there, and how they can get buy-in was really important in that program. And actually there was also another group, some women who used to make craft with shells that came out of that area, and they would also have not been able to support their families because they had money for that. You know, they got money from that. So, and the other example she had was, if you're working in a community which is a Muslim community, how do Christians get a voice? Because they're not even invited in. So anyway, a couple of examples.
Thanks, that's a great example from fisheries. And it reminds me as well that within the project we work in Bangladesh, another aspect of building gender transformation was around working with support groups. So the community leaders had these committees that had to be gender diverse. That was one of the requirements of them being in that role. And they worked with the local religious leaders. So this was in quite conservative Muslim parts of Bangladesh as well. And then they worked with disability support organisations and women's support organisations in those places, as well as local teachers. So there was like a sense of working with leadership as well to shift the norms, and then all of them discussed together around what were the rights of the local people and what were the rights of these different groups as well. And that had really tangible change because then through that kind of local buy-in, they then lobbied the government started providing toilets for people with disabilities, provided menstrual pads and washing basins for girls at school, private bathrooms, and sort of more specialised services that met the needs of different groups.
Unless there's somebody else that needs to ask. A really difficult question, but any thoughts? You're just talking about Bangladesh and the involvement of government. Any thoughts on countries where the government is dysfunctional or dictatorial, like Haiti or Afghanistan, or countries where it's difficult to actually work with those in power? Sorry, difficult question again.
I can't speak from my lived experience on that topic, though the governments that I've worked with in Southeast Asia, that there is some elements of authoritarianism, but certainly like patriarchal. So, for example, I was part of a monitoring of a project with the National Police in Indonesia, and we were looking at how they integrated understanding of gender inclusion within their training institutes. And went into the meeting room with my Indonesian colleague and sat down, and there was like this panel of men and then a couple of women on the side, and they brought cups of tea for us and didn't really have a speaking role in the meeting. But I think, yeah, what we talked about in that meeting was really around what was their understanding of gender inclusion, like what do they think gender equality means? And even though that differed to mine and to my colleagues, we were able to have an exchange around that and try and share perspectives and try and shift them. And I think in that context, it's really challenging because I'm aware of my own status as an outsider, and that I come from a different religious and cultural background, and that I'm seen in a particular way. But I think, yeah, just really the conversation and trying to relate to people as humans. So that has been my work. Yeah.
Hi, Tamara. A question. So we've kind of got the GE bit down with our partners, or at least a discussion happening on gender equality, disability inclusion as well. But with the social inclusion part, and especially around LGBTQI inclusion, I mean, we're finding it quite difficult to even engage because we're talking and working with people who are working in an environment in which it is illegal. And yeah, I guess just some advice on broaching subjects. I mean, I also work for a faith-based agency, and so yeah, there's this kind of elephant in the room. And if we're talking about SI, why aren't we talking more strongly about LGBTQI inclusion? But also, even bringing that up, partner has said to me, well, we just don't even have any leverage point whatsoever because it's illegal here. So we don't, you know, where can we move within that? Anyway, any advice?
Yeah, that's a really kind of common challenge, I think, Jacinta, and as something I'm coming across with the refugee research that I'm doing with LGBT people in Southeast Asia, because in Malaysia, homosexuality is legal, and in Indonesia, it's not, but there's increasing discrimination. I think, I suppose that I find that there is a difference between social norms and laws. And so it probably depends how you're trying to tackle it. I don't know the exact context, but working with people in rights-based organizations who value human care and dignity, then they can genuinely understand the importance of protection for all people, like including people with diverse and sexual orientation. I think when talking about advocacy, then it gets into that area of like what can really change within a context like that where there's legal implications, not only for LGBTIQ people, but also perhaps the activists or the people that are trying to support them. There might be backlash. So a gently approach, and also unfortunately, like there's going to be some countries where it's easier to broach these topics than others. And I think Tina Dixon is speaking tomorrow, in Canberra, and she's really great on this topic as well, around queer rights and advocacy. I think that all kind of development practitioners will approach it differently, like whether they want to be an outspoken kind of face it head on, say what should happen, or it's like building a community of practice in the background, or whether it's like just providing safe spaces where people can come to and talk about the challenges they're facing without trying to change the law. So I think no clear answer, sorry. A few ideas.
If we had all the answers, we'd just be out doing the things. I think we're getting towards our final few questions, but really happy to take some more contributions from all of you. All right, in that case, I'm going to have a question. I feel like I've been around in the sector long enough, and I know anyone who starts a sentence with that automatically sounds really old. I've been around long enough to see conversations around, depends when it is as to what it's called, racial justice, racial injustice, decolonisation, and other aspects of intersectionality and social justice talked about. And they will come up often in a great blaze of passion and focus. And then, at least after some period of time, often sort of fade a little bit. And it felt to me like perhaps one of the positives to have come out of Black Lives Matter was that there is now, there feels like there's a moral force and a moral urgency around those kinds of questions now that is not just going to allow us to say, well, we had that discussion, that was nice, which was quite hard too. So now we're moving on to the next thing. Wonder what your thinking is about the extent to which you think that moral force can carry us forward, or is there a risk that intersectionality, I'm sure agencies will continue to be intersectional in their thinking about their work, but what risk is there perhaps that particularly funders decide, yeah, we did that, and now, oh, that thing over there is quite shiny. We're going to go and do that instead. What do you think?
You're asking me to predict the future?
Sure, we'll do that.
I guess, yeah, I kind of share a concern that maybe Gen Z is that thing at the moment, like using gender, social inclusion, disability, then becomes a particular framing that loses some of their kind of conceptual weight that was there with intersectional feminist thinking. And I think perhaps some people are afraid of feminism. Like, I do think that the ideas of intersectionality and feminism are intricately linked. And so if funders are concerned about having the word feminist in their strategy or their policy, then it's less likely to have that strength. So I'm not sure what direction it's going to go. I think like the current government in Australia is quite interested in having a progressive gender policy that would include consideration of intersecting difference and changing the status quo. I don't know if it's going to come through on that promise. And I think when you're speaking there about the connection with racial justice issues or decolonizing, that's an even bigger ask, right? Because it's saying, can we actually move the resources and power in the development program into the hands and the minds of the people that are most concerned, rather than it being controlled from Australian agencies. And there's a massive risk for them in that, but it also is a paradigm shift. So I think that takes a lot of work. Yeah.
And it's been really interesting to see, for instance, USAID say, yes, we absolutely need to localise our program and we've got these targets and we're going for it. And they get to the end of about year one and go, we worked really hard and we got that far of the way because turns out it's really hard. Yeah, for sure. Happy to take one or two other questions. I didn't mean to jump in, and maybe someone else had a thought in the meantime. Okay, look, Tamara is here for a little longer, so are we all. We can ask those questions that we think of over another drink and something to eat. That feels like a good time to wind up the formal part of proceedings, so I'd like you to join me in thanking Tamara for her time and insights. And we'd like to show our appreciation with a small gift.
Oh, thank you.
This is a Women in Aid and Development coffee mug. So you will have the best beverage in the office.
Thanks so
Sorry
much.
about the packaging's not quite up to scratch. We hope to see you again. Bring your colleagues next time. I'd like to thank the rest of the Women in Aid and Development Leadership Group who've helped us put tonight together, the volunteers who are here this evening, and Chris, our chair, who always brings us all together. Please connect with us online, either via the website, on Facebook or LinkedIn. That's it. You'll be the first to know about future events if you join our mailing list, and if you become a member, which will assist us financially, you'll also be given the opportunity to participate in our mentoring program. Our next event will be on Tuesday, the 10th of October, back in this fine venue again. Please go up the back near the drinks table afterwards and give us your thoughts on what the topic should be. You can also sign up, tell us some interesting things that you think you'd like us to put on social, your takeaways and things out of this evening. So please give us your thoughts. It's all in your hands. But for now, that's the end of the session. Thank you for being here. Thank you for participating. And because Chris is the chair, I can't deny her the last word.
Sure. We can send you some too. So I just want to say thank you as well. And yes, you can't shut me up. I want to really thank Michelle for being a great facilitator once again. Really always incredibly well prepared. And to just let you know, tomorrow evening's event in Canberra is actually going to be online now. So if you haven't had quite enough intersectionality, tomorrow it's Tina Dixon is going to be speaking. And if you're interested, Just pop your name on one of the little squares with your email address and just write Canberra, and I'll send you the link and you can have that tomorrow. So yeah, let us know. That'll be 6:30 till probably 7:30, 7:45. Thank you very much. And thanks to Canva for having us once again.